He mocked my career in front of his colleagues. I showed them who really runs the room. You know what they say about karma. Sometimes she doesn't wait. Sometimes she shows up to the party wearing your exact outfit, speaking your language, and ready to play your game better than you ever could. I should have seen it coming the moment he suggested I wear the navy dress instead of my power suit. But hindsight is 20/20, and love makes us blind to the red flags waving right in front of our faces. My name is Delilah Sinclair, and this is the story of how my husband tried to humiliate me at the most important corporate event of his career, and how I turned his boardroom into my battlefield. The evening started innocently enough. Well, as innocent as any corporate schmoozing event can be when your husband works for one of those tech companies that thinks ping-pong tables and kombucha on tap make up for soul-crushing overtime and toxic masculinity masquerading as disruption. Connor had been preparing for this quarterly review dinner for weeks. His company, NextGen Solutions, was hosting their biggest clients and investors at the Meridian Club. You know, one of those exclusive venues where the cheapest bottle of wine costs more than most people's rent. Connor had been gunning for a promotion to Senior Director of Business Development, and this dinner was essentially his audition. "Just smile and look pretty," he'd said that morning, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "These guys don't really care about what women do anyway. They just want to see that their executives have stable home lives." I should have unpacked that comment right then and there. But I was running late for my own morning meeting with a potential client. A Fortune 500 company interested in hiring my consulting firm to overhaul their entire digital marketing strategy. You know, that little hobby of mine that Connor liked to call playing business. That should have been red flag number 2. Red flag number 1 was 6 months earlier when I'd landed my biggest contract to date. A multi-million-dollar deal with Hartwell Industries. Connor's response: "That's nice, honey. Did you remember to pick up my dry cleaning?" But I digress. Let me paint you the picture of that evening. The Meridian Club screamed old money and new arrogance. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, casting warm light over mahogany-paneled walls lined with portraits of dead white men who probably made their fortunes exploiting people who looked nothing like them. The kind of place where handshakes seal deals worth millions and women are expected to be ornamental. I arrived fashionably late. Not by choice, but because my client meeting had run over. We just finalized a deal that would net my firm 7 figures, but I couldn't exactly lead with that information. Connor was already 3 drinks deep into schmoozing mode when I found him near the bar, surrounded by his colleagues and their plus ones. "There she is," Connor announced as I approached, his voice carrying that particular brand of false enthusiasm that men use when they're performing masculinity for an audience. "Gentlemen, meet my beautiful wife, Delilah." The group turned toward me with polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. I recognized most of them from Connor's work stories. Brad, the VP who still thought sexual harassment training was a suggestion. Marcus, the sales director who measured success by how many bottles of scotch he could expense in a month. And Kevin, Connor's direct supervisor, whose idea of innovation was adding more buzzwords to PowerPoint presentations. "Delilah runs a little consulting business," Connor continued, and I felt my spine stiffen at the word little. "She helps companies with their social media and marketing stuff. Very cute." Cute. He called my business cute. In that moment I had a choice. I could smile and nod, play the supportive wife role, and let Connor have his moment in the spotlight. Or I could remind him, and everyone else in that circle, exactly who he was dealing with. I chose option 3. Strategic patience. "How wonderful," said Patricia, Kevin's wife, a woman whose primary accomplishment seemed to be maintaining her figure after 3 kids and a husband who traveled more than a flight attendant. "Social media is so important these days. My daughter does Instagram for a local boutique." "Oh, it's a bit more complex than Instagram management," I replied with a smile that could have powered the chandelier above us. "I specialize in comprehensive digital transformation strategies for Fortune 500 companies. Multi-platform integration, data analytics, consumer behavior modeling. That sort of thing." Connor's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "She makes it sound so fancy, doesn't she? It's basically posting on Facebook and Twitter for companies that are too busy making real money to bother with social media. The group chuckled, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Not embarrassment, anger. Pure, crystalline anger that started in my chest and spread outward like wildfire. But I kept smiling. "Connor's being modest about my work," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "He always downplays things he doesn't understand." The smile on Connor's face flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Well, we can't all be changing the world one tweet at a time, can we?" More chuckles from the peanut gallery. I noticed that the wives were looking uncomfortable now, their smiles becoming strained. They recognized the tone of a man who was about to go too far, even if he didn't. Speaking of changing the world, Kevin interjected, clearly sensing the tension and trying to redirect. "Connor was just telling us about the Morrison account." "Impressive work. 3 million in new revenue," Connor preened, puffing out his chest like a peacock. "Sometimes you have to show these smaller companies what real business looks like." "Morrison Industries?" I asked, my eyebrows rising in genuine surprise. "David Morrison's company." "You know David?" Brad asked, looking skeptical that someone who played business would know a real CEO. "We just finished our second quarter working together," I said casually, taking a sip of my wine. "Lovely man. Very forward-thinking. He told me he was considering NextGen for their cloud infrastructure needs." The circle went quiet. Connor's face was cycling through several different shades of confusion. "What do you mean, working together?" Marcus asked. "I'm overseeing the complete digital transformation of Morrison Industries. It's been quite the project. 18 months, full-scale rebranding, new customer acquisition strategies, integration of AI-driven analytics platforms. We've increased their online revenue by 340% so far." Connor looked like someone had just told him Santa Claus was real and lived in his attic. That's impossible. David Morrison is a serious businessman. He wouldn't hire some little marketing consultant for a project like that." Some little marketing consultant. There it was. The mask was off. "Interesting choice of words, Connor," I said, my voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that anyone who's ever been in a real boardroom knows means someone's about to get destroyed. Especially considering David specifically mentioned that he's only working with NextGen because I recommended you. You know that moment in movies when the music stops and everyone freezes? That's what happened next. The entire circle went silent, as if I'd just announced that aliens had landed on the roof and they were here for the shrimp cocktail. Connor's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What do you mean you recommended me?" "I mean exactly what I said. David asked me if I knew any competent firms for his infrastructure needs. I mentioned that my husband worked for NextGen. Though now I'm starting to wonder if I should have recommended someone else." Kevin was staring at me like I'd just solved world hunger. "You're telling me that the Morrison account, our biggest potential client this quarter, came through you?" "Well, technically it came through my professional reputation and David's trust in my business judgment. But yes, if you want to oversimplify it." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my messages until I found what I was looking for. Actually, I have David's text from this afternoon right here. He was asking about Connor's qualifications because he wanted to make sure NextGen was the right fit. I held up the phone, showing a message that read, "Delilah, your husband better be as sharp as you are. This infrastructure overhaul is going to make or break our Q4 projections. I'm trusting your judgment here." The blood had completely drained from Connor's face. Around us, other conversations were starting to quiet as people picked up on the tension in our little circle. "You never mentioned," Connor started, his voice barely above a whisper. "You never asked," I replied, sliding my phone back into my purse. "You were too busy telling people about my little business and how I play at marketing to bother learning what I actually do." Patricia was looking at Connor with the kind of disgust usually reserved for people who don't clean up after their dogs. The other wives were exchanging glances that could have started and ended wars. But it was Kevin's expression that really told the story. As Connor's boss, he was rapidly calculating the implications of what I'd just revealed. His golden boy, his potential senior director, had been dismissing and belittling the very person responsible for their biggest potential account. "How long have you been working with Morrison Industries?" Kevin asked, his tone carefully neutral. 14 months. We're also in talks with Hartwell Industries, Pinnacle Corp., and Blackstone Enterprises for similar transformations. Combined, they represent about $40 million in potential business for various service providers. I let that number hang in the air like smoke from a very expensive cigar. "And you've been recommending service providers to them?" Brad asked, clearly trying to understand the scope of what Connor had just stepped in. "When they ask for recommendations, yes. I've built relationships with these CEOs over years of delivering results. They trust my judgment." Connor was still standing there like a statue, processing the reality that his wife wasn't just some woman with a hobby, but someone with more professional influence than he'd ever dreamed of having. "Connor," Kevin said slowly, "did you know about any of this?" She never said. Connor stammered. "I tried to tell you about the Hartwell contract," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You told me it was nice and asked if I'd picked up your dry cleaning. I tried to tell you about Morrison Industries. You said you didn't have time to hear about my little projects because you had real work to do." The circle was expanding now as other people started to drift over, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood in the water. I could see Connor's colleagues' wives looking at him with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. "Delilah," Kevin said, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head, "would you be interested in discussing some potential partnerships between your firm and NextGen? It sounds like there might be some significant synergies." Before I could answer, Connor finally found his voice. "She's not. This is ridiculous. Delilah, stop embarrassing me." Stop embarrassing him. The entire room seemed to inhale at once. In corporate circles, there are things you just don't say, lines you don't cross, especially not in public. Telling your wife to stop embarrassing you after you've spent the evening doing exactly that to her? That's not just crossing the line. That's taking a flamethrower to it. I set my wine glass down on the nearest table with deliberate precision. When I looked back up at Connor, my smile could have cut diamonds. "Embarrassing you," I repeated, my voice carrying just enough to ensure everyone within a 15-foot radius could hear. "Connor, sweetheart, I haven't even started." I turned to address the expanded group that had gathered around us. "Since we're all here, let me properly introduce myself. My name is Delilah Sinclair, and I'm the founder and CEO of Catalyst Consulting Group. We specialize in digital transformation strategies for Fortune 500 companies." I paused to let that sink in. Some of you might be familiar with our work. We recently completed the Hartwell Industries transformation. You know, the one that increased their market cap by 12% over 8 months. That was us. We're currently working with Morrison Industries, Pinnacle Corp., and Blackstone Enterprises on similar projects. Kevin was nodding slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Catalyst Consulting Group. You're the firm that's been revolutionizing digital marketing integration in the manufacturing sector." "That's right. We've been featured in Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and Fortune magazine. Our client retention rate is 97%, and our average ROI improvement is 230%. Connor was looking around the circle like he was hoping someone would tell him this was all an elaborate prank. The Morrison account that Connor was just bragging about, that came through my recommendation. David Morrison is a client of mine who asked if I knew any reliable infrastructure firms. I mentioned my husband's company because I believed in giving family members opportunities to prove themselves. I turned to look directly at Connor. Apparently, that was a mistake in judgment. What happened next was beautiful in its simplicity. Kevin, being the politically savvy executive he was, immediately recognized that Connor had just committed career suicide in front of half the company's leadership. "Mrs. Sinclair," Kevin said, his tone completely different now. Respectful, professional, maybe even a little desperate. I had no idea we had such a distinguished professional in our midst. I'm deeply sorry if anyone gave you the impression that your work wasn't valued or understood. The apology wasn't for me. It was for the $40 million in potential business that Connor had just jeopardized with his caveman routine. Oh, I think the impression was quite clear, I replied. Connor's been very consistent in his messaging about my work. Patricia had moved away from Connor like he had something contagious. The other wives were whispering among themselves, shooting Connor looks that could have wilted flowers. Brad, ever the opportunist, jumped in. You know, my wife Lisa has been looking for someone to help with her boutique's online presence. Maybe you could. I appreciate the thought, I interrupted smoothly. But we only work with companies that have annual revenues above 50 million. Insurance requirements, you understand. Lisa looked like she wanted to crawl under the Persian rug. Meanwhile, Marcus was frantically typing on his phone, probably Googling my company to see if everything I was saying was true. Based on his expression, he was finding exactly what he expected to find. Connor, Kevin said, his voice carrying that particular tone that means someone's about to get fired or demoted or both. Perhaps we should have a conversation about communication and professional courtesy. I don't understand what's happening, Connor said, and for the first time all evening, he was telling the absolute truth. What's happening, I said, stepping closer to Connor so I could speak quietly but still be heard by our audience, is that you just spent the evening belittling your wife's career in front of your colleagues, only to discover that your wife's career is significantly more successful and influential than your own. I gestured to the circle around us. What's happening is that these people are realizing that you've been lying by omission about your professional connections. What's happening is that your boss is calculating how much money you may have just cost this company by insulting the person who's been sending business your way. Connor's face was cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Confusion, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been the first stirrings of understanding. But you never told me, he started. I tried to tell you, repeatedly. You weren't interested in listening. You were more interested in maintaining your fiction that your wife was some kind of amateur playing at business. I turned back to Kevin. To answer your earlier question about partnerships, I think that conversation might be premature. I'll need to reassess whether NextGen aligns with my client's values around professional respect and gender equality. Kevin looked like I'd just threatened to take away his birthday. Of course, I completely understand. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to discuss how we might better demonstrate those values. Perhaps, I said non-committally. The beautiful thing about corporate events is that news travels fast. By the time Connor and I made it to the parking garage an hour later, my phone was buzzing with texts from David Morrison, who'd apparently heard from someone who'd heard from someone else about the evening's entertainment. David wants to know if there are any issues with the NextGen partnership, I told Connor as we waited for the valet to bring our car around. He's concerned that there might be cultural misalignment between our companies. Connor was slumped against a concrete pillar, looking like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using interpretive dance. Delilah, I'm sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You were comfortable with your version of reality where I was the little woman with a cute hobby and you were the big important businessman. The valet brought our car around. Connor moved to get in the driver's seat, but I held out my hand for the keys. I'll drive. You're clearly not in any condition to operate heavy machinery. He handed over the keys without argument. We drove home in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of a couple who'd enjoyed a nice evening out. It was the loaded silence of a relationship that had just been fundamentally altered by truth. The next morning, Connor left for work without his usual swagger. Around 10 a.m., my assistant forwarded me an email from Kevin, requesting a meeting to discuss potential collaboration opportunities and address any concerns about corporate culture alignment. By noon, I had similar requests from 3 other companies whose executives had been at the dinner. Apparently, word had spread about the woman who'd quietly built a multi-million-dollar consulting empire while her husband dismissed her work as a hobby. Connor came home that evening looking like he'd been hit by a truck. They want me to take sensitivity training, he said, dropping into our kitchen chair like a sack of rocks. Kevin says it's either that or they'll have to reassess my fit within the company culture. And how do you feel about that? I asked, not looking up from my laptop where I was reviewing contracts. How do I feel? Delilah, you destroyed my career tonight. I closed my laptop and looked at him directly. Connor, I didn't destroy your career. Your attitude toward women and your inability to respect your own wife's accomplishments destroyed your career. I just provided the venue. What followed was the first real conversation Connor and I had in years. Not the surface-level discussions about schedules and social obligations and whose turn it was to deal with the landscaper, but an actual conversation about who we were and what we wanted and whether there was any version of our marriage that could survive the truth. I don't understand how this happened, Connor said, his head in his hands. I thought I knew you. You knew the version of me that you were comfortable with. The version that made you feel important and successful by comparison. That's not fair. Isn't it? Connor, when was the last time you asked me about my work? Really asked, not just polite small talk. He was quiet for a long time. When was the last time you celebrated one of my victories the way I celebrate yours? Continued. When was the last time you introduced me as something other than my wife? Or mentioned my accomplishments to your friends? I don't know. I do. Never. You've never done any of those things because you've never seen my work as real or important or worthy of respect. We talked until 3 a.m. Connor cried, which I hadn't seen since his father died 5 years earlier. He apologized over and over, until the words started to lose meaning. But here's the thing about apologies. They're not magic erasers. They don't undo years of dismissal and condescension and being made to feel small in your own marriage. I can change, Connor said as dawn was breaking outside our kitchen windows. I want to change. I want to understand your work, to support you the way you've supported me. Do you? Or do you want to change because your job is on the line and you've realized that staying married to me might be good for your career? The question hung between us like smoke. 3 months later, Connor and I were in marriage counseling. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a no-nonsense therapist who specialized in relationships where power dynamics had gotten toxic. She had a gift for cutting through bullshit and a complete intolerance for self-pity. Connor, she said during one particularly intense session, you're asking Delilah to forget years of being diminished so that you can feel better about yourself. That's not how healing works. But I said I was sorry. Saying you're sorry is step 1 of about 100 steps. Delilah doesn't owe you forgiveness just because you've finally recognized what you've been doing. The marriage counseling helped, but not in the way Connor expected. It didn't magically repair our relationship or restore his ego or make everything go back to the way it was before. What it did was give us a safe space to decide whether we wanted to build something new together or acknowledge that some damage can't be repaired. Today, 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, Connor and I are separated. Not divorced. Not yet. But living apart while we figure out who we are as individuals and whether there's any chance of becoming partners instead of adversaries. Connor is still at NextGen, but his promotion was indefinitely postponed. He's in therapy, both individual and group sessions for men who struggle with gender equality in professional settings. He's learning to see women as colleagues and competitors and equals instead of decorations or threats. I'm thriving. My business has expanded to include 3 new major clients, all Fortune 500 companies looking for the kind of digital transformation that I've become known for. Forbes just featured Catalyst Consulting Group in their 40 Under 40 list for game-changing entrepreneurs. David Morrison still sends me Christmas cards. Looking back on that evening at the Meridian Club, I realize it wasn't really about Connor's behavior at a corporate dinner. It was about years of accumulated small humiliations, tiny cuts that had bled my self-respect slowly until I almost forgot what it felt like to be seen and valued for who I really was. The dinner was just the moment when I decided to stop bleeding quietly. Women, especially successful women, are often taught to make themselves smaller to preserve their relationships. We're told to downplay our achievements, to avoid making our partners feel threatened, to choose harmony over honesty. But here's what I learned. A relationship that requires you to diminish yourself isn't a relationship worth preserving. Connor's colleagues learned something that night too. They learned that the quiet woman in the corner might be the most powerful person in the room. They learned that dismissing someone based on gender or assumptions about their capabilities can have real professional consequences. Most importantly, they learned that respect isn't optional in professional settings, even when you're talking to someone's wife. The story doesn't end with me triumphantly walking away from my marriage or Connor learning to respect women or even with my business success. It ends with something more complex and more realistic. The recognition that change is hard and takes time and doesn't always result in happy endings. Connor and I may not find our way back to each other. The years of dismissal and condescension may have done too much damage for repair. But Connor is learning to be a better man, and I'm learning to never again accept less than I deserve. That's not a fairy tale ending, but it's a real one. I still get invited to corporate events, but now I'm invited as myself. CEO Delilah Sinclair, not Connor's wife. I give keynote speeches about digital transformation and women in business. I mentor young entrepreneurs and serve on boards of directors. Sometimes I run into Connor's old colleagues at these events. They're always polite, always professional, and they never once mention my husband or ask about my marriage. They've learned. The last time I saw Kevin, he mentioned that NextGen had implemented new diversity and inclusion training for all employees. We want to make sure we're creating an environment where everyone feels valued, he said. That's wonderful, I replied. It's amazing how quickly companies can change when their bottom line depends on it. He had the grace to look embarrassed. But the real victory isn't in Connor's professional struggles or his colleagues' awkward politeness or even my business success. The real victory is in the woman who looked at herself in the mirror the morning after that dinner and decided she would never again pretend to be smaller than she was. That woman. That's who I fought for that night at the Meridian Club. And she was worth fighting for. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth about who you are and what you've accomplished. Sometimes the most radical act is refusing to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. And sometimes, just sometimes, karma shows up wearing your exact outfit and speaking your language. The room was theirs, but the power, that was always mine. Thank you for watching. If you want more videos like this, please like, subscribe and share.